5 wars fought under different flags, 5 generations that never changed, and outcomes that follow the same invisible script. This isn't a story about patriotism. It isn't about strategy rooms or heroic speeches. It's a story about numbers, because numbers don't lie, they repeat. Every time war is announced, the public sees urgency, fear, necessity. But behind the scenes, something else begins moving with precision. Budgets expand, emergency powers unlock spending, contracts are rushed through, supply chains reorganize, and capital flows upward fast. This pattern isn't new. It didn't start yesterday. For over 200 years, every major American war has activated the same financial machinery. Different enemies, different headlines, same beneficiaries. Families that didn't wait for peace, they prepared for conflict. This isn't about a single bad actor. It isn't about one leaked document or exposed deal. It's about a structure where proximity to power matters more than accountability, and foresight matters more than morality. On paper, it all looks clean, legal, ordinary. Procurement contracts, defense budgets, cost overruns explained away by urgency, numbers stacked neatly in columns quietly mirroring each other across decades. The unsettling truth isn't that war creates profit, it's that the profit arrives on schedule. Once you recognize the schedule, wars stop feeling unpredictable. The timing feels intentional, the choices feel weighted, and the question shifts not who fought bravely, but who positioned themselves early. Because this wasn't confusion, this wasn't disorder, this was preparation. Before going any further, there's a reaction this story always triggers. A reflex, a defense mechanism. People hear claims like this and think conspiracy, hidden cabals, secret meetings, smoke-filled rooms. But that's not what this is. Because none of what you're about to hear is hidden. Every number comes from government contracts. Every claim traces back to congressional investigations, court records, budget reports, and public filings. These aren't leaks, they're receipts. Filed, stamped, archived, and mostly ignored. That's what makes this uncomfortable. If this were secret, it would be easier to dismiss. But it isn't. The evidence has been sitting in plain sight for decades, scattered across boring documents no one reads and hearings no one watches. War profiteering didn't survive because it was concealed. It survived because it was normalized. Whenever these patterns surfaced, the response was always the same. Investigations were opened, reports were written, fines were issued, and then the system moved on because the companies involved weren't fringe players, they were essential. Too embedded in national security to disrupt, too intertwined with the economy to challenge. So the story was never whether it happened. That was already proven. The story was whether anyone would connect the dots. This isn't about accusing individuals in dark rooms, it's about tracing incentives in daylight. When you follow the contracts instead of the headlines, a different version of history appears, one where war isn't chaos, but continuity. And the paper trail never lies. The receipts are public. Once you accept that the records are real, the next step is understanding how the system actually works. Not morally, mechanically. Think of war less like an explosion and more like a machine. Every machine has inputs and outputs. You put something in, you get something out. War is no different. The inputs are fear, uncertainty, and political urgency. A threat appears, a deadline is created, leaders are told there is no time to hesitate. Decisions must be made immediately. That urgency is the fuel. When governments feel pressure, normal rules break down, competitive bidding disappears, oversight weakens, speed becomes more important than efficiency. And into that moment step companies that are already positioned, already connected, already approved. The output is predictable, contracts are awarded, budgets expand, risk is transferred away from private companies and absorbed by the public. One of the most common tools is something called a cost-plus contract. It sounds technical, but it's simple. The government agrees to pay every cost the company incurs, plus a guaranteed profit on top. In any normal business, higher costs mean failure. In war, higher costs mean higher profit. There is no incentive to finish early, no penalty for overruns. Delays don't hurt the contractor, they help them. The longer the war machine runs, the more money flows through it. Once this structure is in place, outcomes stop mattering, victory or defeat becomes secondary, the machine pays either way, and that's the moment most people miss. War doesn't need to be won to be profitable, it just needs to continue. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The first family to perfect this system did it before the United States even understood what it was becoming. Long before defense contractors had names, before the phrase military-industrial complex existed, one company learned how to turn readiness into inevitability. The DuPont family didn't wait for war, they prepared for it. In 1802, when America was still young and unstable, DuPont built gunpowder mills along the Brandywine River. The location wasn't accidental, close enough to power centers to deliver quickly, far enough away that explosions wouldn't cause political problems. Capacity came first, contracts came later. When the War of 1812 began, the government didn't search for options. It went to the company that was already producing. DuPont supplied the powder, they expanded production, they made profits. And when the war ended, they didn't shut down. They kept the mills, they kept the infrastructure, they waited. That waiting was the strategy. Every conflict after followed the same rhythm. The Mexican-American War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Each time, the government needed explosives immediately. Each time, DuPont was ready before anyone else. And readiness beat ideology every time. During the Civil War, members of the DuPont family politically opposed abolition. Some sympathized with the Confederacy. None of that mattered. The Union had the contracts. DuPont sold to the Union. Profit didn't care about belief. By World War I, the scale exploded. DuPont supplied nearly half of all Allied explosives. Profits didn't just grow, they multiplied. And when the war ended, the money didn't go back to the public. It was reinvested. Chemicals, plastics, materials. A peacetime empire built with wartime cash. War didn't make DuPont rich once. It taught them how to stay rich forever. War doesn't reward belief. It rewards preparation. Once a company delivers in one war, it stops being just a supplier. It becomes a reference point. Governments remember who showed up when everything was urgent and nothing could fail. In peacetime, officials talk about competition and efficiency. In wartime, they talk about reliability, and reliability almost always means familiarity. When the next conflict begins, there isn't time to experiment. No one wants to test a new supplier while soldiers are already deploying, so the government goes back to the same names, the same companies, the same contracts. What started as a single emergency decision turns into a permanent advantage. This is how preferred suppliers are born. Once you're inside that circle, you don't compete the way normal businesses do. You're no longer bidding to win, you're bidding to confirm. The paperwork still exists, but the outcome is mostly decided before the ink dries. New competitors can underbid, innovate, even outperform, and still lose. Because wars aren't won by lowest cost. They're won by whoever is already trusted. And that trust compounds. Factories built for one war don't disappear after peace. They sit ready, skilled workers stay employed, political relationships deepen. So when the next crisis arrives, these companies can say something no one else can. We're already producing. That sentence is worth billions. Every successful delivery makes the next contract easier. Every contract makes the company more essential, and eventually the idea of replacing them feels dangerous, risky, unpatriotic. This is how temporary emergency decisions quietly turn into permanent monopolies, not by law, by habit. Winning once doesn't just mean winning that war. It means being first in line for the next one. Winning once means winning forever. By the time war reached the industrial age, explosives were no longer enough. Armies could fight without gunpowder, they couldn't move without fuel. And no family understood that sooner or exploited it more completely than the Rockefellers. Oil didn't just power factories. It powered ships, trucks, tanks, planes. It determined how far an army could advance and how long it could stay there. Control the fuel, and you controlled the pace of war itself. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into something far beyond a company. By the late 19th century, it controlled nearly everything that mattered in energy, refining, distribution, pricing. When the U.S. Navy began shifting from coal to oil, Standard Oil quietly became a strategic asset. The Spanish-American War was short, but it proved the point. Modern navies ran on petroleum. Wars could no longer be fought without it. From that moment on, every major conflict required oil at an industrial scale. World War I made the dependency absolute. Trucks replaced horses, tanks crossed battlefields, aircraft filled the skies, and every one of them burned fuel. Rockefeller companies supplied oil to the United States and its allies, but that wasn't the whole story. Through subsidiaries and foreign partners, Rockefeller-linked companies also sold oil to America's enemies. Different corporate entities, different flags, same profit stream, legal, documented, profitable. This wasn't betrayal, it was structure. After antitrust laws broke Standard Oil into pieces, the monopoly didn't vanish. It multiplied. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron. Different names. Same control, same families, same influence. War after war, oil contracts flowed, guaranteed demand, guaranteed government payment, guaranteed profit. And when investigations surfaced trading with adversaries, sharing patents, extending conflicts, they quietly ended. The military needed the fuel. Accountability became optional. By the time the public caught on, the wealth was already locked in. Oil money diversified into banks, real estate, universities, foundations. The war profits were buried under respectability. Wars run on fuel, and fuel never asks who's fighting. By this point, a pattern should feel familiar. Every time scrutiny appears, it runs into the same wall. Not denial, not outrage, necessity. When companies become essential to national security, the rules change. Investigations don't end with accountability, they end with silence. Because punishing a supplier in the middle of a conflict feels dangerous, risky, even unpatriotic. That's how national security turns into a shield. Again and again, congressional committees uncovered overcharging, price fixing, conflicts of interest. Reports were written, headlines appeared briefly, and then the consequences stopped short of anything that might disrupt the flow of war. Fines were paid, not prison sentences. Settlements were reached. Not admissions of guilt. Contracts continued, often expanded. The logic was always the same. These companies were too important to lose. The military depended on them. The economy relied on their factories and workers. Lawmakers needed the jobs in their districts. Accountability became a threat to stability, so wrongdoing was treated as a cost of doing business. A line item, something to be absorbed and moved past. When fines are smaller than profits, they stop being punishments. They become fees. And this protection compounds just like profit does. Once a company survives one investigation without consequence, it sends a signal. Not just to itself, but to everyone watching. Push the limits. The system will bend. The worst outcome is a fine that barely dents revenue. That's when power becomes self-reinforcing. Companies don't just supply war, they outgrow the ability of the state to discipline them. They become untouchable, not because they're innocent, but because confronting them would mean confronting the system itself. Too big to fail wasn't strong enough. They became too vital to jail. Weapons and fuel get the attention, but none of it moves without money. Wars are expensive long before the first shot is fired. Governments don't have the cash on hand to fight them, they borrow. And the people who lend that money don't need to pick a side, they only need interest. That's where the Morgan banking dynasty enters the story. By the late 19th century, J.P. Morgan and his network of banks had become the financial backbone of the American government. They didn't just store money, they moved it, structured it, and decided who had access to it. When wars began, Morgan understood something simple and ruthless. Governments at war will borrow at any rate. They have no alternative. The Spanish-American War was small, but it set the precedent. Morgan banks financed government spending and collected interest. World War I changed everything. Before the United States officially entered the war, Morgan-led banks were already lending billions to Britain and France. Those loans weren't charity, they were leverage. By the time America debated entering the war, the outcome was already entangled with finance. If the Allies lost, they couldn't repay their debts. And if they couldn't repay, American banks would collapse. Neutrality stopped being moral or political. It became financially impossible. Once the U.S. entered the war, the profit loop tightened. Governments borrowed. Morgan underwrote the debt. Interest accumulated. After the war, the same banks arranged the loans that allowed defeated nations to pay reparations money that circled back to repay earlier debts. Fees were collected at every step. Victory didn't matter. Defeat didn't matter. Debt always paid. World War II followed the same logic. War bonds, treasury issuance, reconstruction financing. And when the Cold War began, the lending never stopped. Different conflicts, same mechanism. Wars don't need belief. They need loans. There's a moment in every conflict where debate quietly ends. Not because everyone agrees, but because too much money is already on the table. Once governments borrow at scale, war stops being a question of policy and becomes a question of protection. Financial exposure creates its own gravity. The deeper the debt, the narrower the choices. At first, leaders talk about diplomacy, sanctions, negotiations, time. But behind those conversations, balances are shifting, loans are issued, factories ramp up, supply chains lock in. Entire industries begin depending on the continuation of conflict. And suddenly, peace isn't neutral anymore. Peace becomes expensive. If a war ends too early, contracts are cut short. Loans go unpaid, factories idle, jobs disappear, markets react. The cost of stopping starts to look higher than the cost of continuing. That's the pivot point, the moment when war stops being driven by threat and starts being driven by exposure. At that point, decisions feel inevitable. Leaders talk about obligation, stability, credibility. But what they're really protecting is a web of financial commitments that can't survive a sudden end. This is how wars outlive their original reasons. What began as a response to danger becomes a mechanism for avoiding collapse. Ending the conflict would trigger losses too large to absorb, so the war continues. Not because it's being won, not because it's just, but because stopping would break too many balance sheets at once. This is the moment no history book highlights, the moment when war becomes the least costly option for those in power. At a certain point, peace costs more than war. Once war reaches that stage, the next winners are already waiting. Because modern wars aren't fought with stockpiles, they're fought with systems, aircraft, missiles, surveillance platforms so complex that once you start building them, you can't stop. That's where Lockheed enters. Lockheed didn't become powerful by building the best weapons, it became powerful by building weapons that couldn't be abandoned. From the beginning, the strategy was simple. Underestimate the cost, win the contract, and once billions are spent, make cancellation politically impossible. During World War II, aircraft became decisive. Fighters, bombers, transports, all essential. Lockheed delivered. And when the war ended, instead of shrinking, it adapted. Cold War fear replaced hot war urgency. New enemies, new technologies, new contracts. But the real innovation wasn't engineering, it was politics. Lockheed learned to spread production across congressional districts. Factories here, suppliers there, thousands of jobs tied to a single program. That way, canceling a weapon system didn't just mean canceling a contract, it meant canceling livelihoods in dozens of states. Senators didn't need to be bribed. They were structurally invested. Then came cost overruns. Projects ran late, budgets exploded, estimates quietly doubled, then tripled. In any normal industry, that would mean failure. In defense contracting, it meant leverage. Once the government had already invested billions, walking away became unthinkable. The sunk costs were too high, the embarrassment too great. So the Pentagon paid, over and over again. Cost-plus contracts guaranteed profit no matter how inefficient the process became. Delays increased revenue, complexity protected margins, and every investigation ended the same way: fines, settlements, no jail time, contracts renewed. Lockheed perfected a system where failure paid better than success. You can't cancel a weapon that employs a nation. From the outside, it looks like a market. Multiple companies, bids, committees, regulations. The language of competition is everywhere. But defense contracting doesn't behave like a real market because real markets punish failure. War does the opposite. In a normal industry, if you miss deadlines, blow past budgets, or deliver a flawed product, you lose customers. In war, urgency rewrites the rules. Deadlines become flexible. Budgets become suggestions. And failure is explained away as complexity. There's always a reason. The technology was unprecedented. The threat evolved. The battlefield changed. And because national security is at stake, no one wants to be the person who stopped funding a program that might be needed tomorrow. So competition becomes theater. New companies rarely break in, not because they're incapable, but because they can't promise what the incumbents can. Continuity. The existing contractors already have clearances, factories, political relationships, and decades of trust built under crisis. Challenging them feels like gambling with safety. And when a contractor fails spectacularly, the response isn't removal, it's reinforcement. More money to fix the problem, more time to complete the system, more contracts to stabilize the supplier. The incentives are upside down. Efficiency doesn't win. Speed doesn't win. Even quality doesn't always win. What wins is entanglement. The deeper a company is woven into the military, the harder it is to replace. At a certain point, the government isn't buying a product anymore. It's maintaining a dependency. That's why the same names keep appearing decade after decade, not because they're unbeatable, but because the system makes replacing them feel dangerous. In war, inefficiency pays. The most profitable part of war isn't always the fighting. It's everything that happens around it. Armies don't just need weapons, they need bases, roads, airfields, food, fuel, power, water, waste removal, constant movement of people and supplies through hostile territory. And every one of those needs turns into a contract. That's where Halliburton built its empire. Halliburton understood early that wars create chaos and chaos kills competition. When troops are deploying and timelines are measured in days, not months, governments don't open bidding processes. They call the companies that can move immediately. The ones with equipment, logistics, networks, and political access already in place. From World War II onward, Halliburton specialized in speed, build fast, deliver fast, bill later. Bases rose in deserts almost overnight, ports were expanded, airfields carved out of nothing, and almost all of it was done under no-bid, cost-plus contracts, which meant risk didn't exist. Every expense was reimbursed. Every delay was paid. Every mistake was profitable. If costs doubled, revenue doubled. And when auditors raised concerns, the explanation was always the same: war zones are unpredictable. Vietnam took this model to scale. Through subsidiaries, Halliburton built infrastructure across South Asia. Roads, camps, supply hubs, Political relationships deepened, donations flowed, and when leadership rotated between government and corporate offices, the contracts followed. By the time the War on Terror began, the system was perfected. Halliburton wasn't just supporting war, it was embedded inside it, feeding troops, transporting fuel, managing logistics so complex that replacing them mid-conflict felt impossible. And when waste and overbilling were exposed, nothing stopped. Fines were absorbed, payments continued, the war needed support. The fighting could end, but the rebuilding never did. The war never ends if rebuilding never stops. By now, the individual stories start to blur together. Different industries, different centuries, different names. But the mechanics never change. This is where everything collapses into a single structure. Strip away the personalities and what's left is a blueprint, a repeatable system refined over generations. Step 1 always comes before the war. Position early, build capacity in peacetime. Become essential before anyone knows they'll need you. Step 2 happens the moment conflict begins. Secure the first contract. Urgency replaces oversight. Speed replaces scrutiny. Once you're inside, everyone else is locked out. Step 3 removes risk entirely. Cost plus pricing guarantees profit no matter what happens. Delays, overruns, mistakes all reimbursed. The public absorbs the downside. The contractor keeps the upside. Step 4 is where profits accelerate. Budgets inflate. Timelines stretch. Complexity multiplies. What looks like incompetence is often incentive. The more expensive the project becomes, the more valuable it is to the company running it. Step 5 locks the system in place. Regulators retire into industry. Generals become executives. Officials who once approved contracts now benefit from them. The revolving door ensures continuity. Step 6 expands the battlefield beyond weapons. Lobbying intensifies. Think tanks publish reports. Media narratives shift. War becomes framed as necessity, hesitation as weakness. The environment is shaped so conflict feels inevitable. And Step 7 ensures the money outlives the war. Profits are diversified into civilian industries, real estate, finance, philanthropy. By the time peace arrives, the wealth is untouchable. This isn't corruption in the shadow. It's optimization in plain sight. 5 families didn't just profit from war. They perfected the process. And once perfected, it didn't need to be reinvented. It only needed to be repeated. This is the blueprint. If this pattern only lived in the past, it would be easier to dismiss. History is full of bad incentives, old systems, lessons learned too late. But this one didn't fade. It scaled. Today, the United States spends more on its military than the next several nations combined, hundreds of billions every year. And a remarkable portion of that money flows to the same small circle of companies, not because of secrecy, but because the system still rewards the same behaviors. Modern defense budgets follow the same logic as 19th century gunpowder contracts. A threat is identified, urgency is declared, funding is approved, and once the money starts moving, it becomes almost impossible to stop. Look at today's largest defense programs. Multi-decade timelines, budgets measured in the trillions, suppliers spread across dozens of states, each one justified as essential, each one framed as too important to cancel. When problems emerge, delays, defects, ballooning costs, the solution is never withdrawal. It's expansion. More funding, more time, more commitment. The language has changed. The technology is more advanced, but the incentives are identical. Companies that fail to deliver on schedule don't lose trust. They gain leverage, because now the government is too invested to walk away. And the relationships remain just as tight. Former defense officials sit on corporate boards. Executives move into advisory roles in government. Lobbying budgets grow alongside military budgets. Think tanks funded by contractors produce reports warning of new threats that conveniently require new systems. This isn't history repeating itself by accident. It's history continuing by design. The same blueprint that worked for gunpowder, oil, loans, planes, and logistics is still running. It's just larger, faster, more expensive. This isn't history. It's now. Once you understand how much money flows through this system, a different question starts to matter. Not how much was spent, but what never happened because of it. Hundreds of billions of dollars didn't vanish. They were redirected. Every war contract funded came from public money. Taxes paid by workers, debt carried by future generations, resources that could only be used once. That's the part rarely discussed. Because opportunity cost doesn't leave rubble, it leaves absence. The schools that weren't built, the hospitals that never opened, the bridges that kept decaying, the research that went unfunded, money that went to explosives couldn't go to education, money that paid for fuel convoys couldn't fund healthcare, money absorbed by cost overruns couldn't repair infrastructure. Every dollar spent sustaining war profits was a dollar not spent sustaining civilian life. And the scale matters. The combined profits extracted by war contractors over generations could have erased student debt, could have modernized transportation nationwide, could have funded universal healthcare for years, could have reshaped entire cities. Instead, that wealth concentrated, protected, reinvested, multiplied, while public systems were told there was no budget. Scarcity became a narrative, but it wasn't real. The money existed, it was simply committed elsewhere. Locked into contracts that couldn't be canceled, protected by urgency, justified by fear. And the most unsettling part is how invisible this loss feels. Bombs leave craters, missiles leave ruins. Opportunity cost leaves nothing you can point to, only the quiet realization that a different future was possible. This is what never got built. There's a reason this pattern survives every generation. Not because no one sees it, but because changing it is politically dangerous. Entire regions depend on defense spending for jobs. Entire careers are built on managing war budgets. Entire institutions are funded by companies that benefit from conflict. Pull one thread, and the system doesn't unravel quietly. It resists. Lawmakers who challenge military spending are accused of endangering national security. Regulators who push too hard find their careers stalled. Presidents who promise reform inherit contracts already signed, factories already running, workers already employed. The cost of stopping feels immediate. The cost of continuing feels abstract. So nothing breaks. The public is distracted by headlines, not balance sheets. Wars are framed as necessity, not choice. And because the consequences are spread across millions of taxpayers and future generations, no single group feels the full weight. Outrage dissolves before it can turn into action. Even when scandals surface, they're treated as exceptions, bad actors in an otherwise sound system, but the system itself never changes. It absorbs the criticism, pays the fines, and keeps operating. That's why every new conflict feels familiar. Different names, different places, same structure, same incentives, same outcome. History isn't warning us, it's demonstrating something. If the system remains intact, the future will look exactly like the past, just more expensive, more automated, and more distant from public control. History says it will happen again. By the time people realize what's really happening, the story is already framed for them. They're told these companies are patriotic, that they protect the nation, that questioning them is naive, or dangerous, or ungrateful, and most people accept that version not because it's true, but because it's simple. The harder truth takes longer to see. That war, in this system, isn't just a tragedy, it's a transaction. A predictable transfer of public money into private hands, justified by fear and protected by urgency. The names change, the weapons evolve, the profits remain. Once you recognize the pattern, history reads differently. Wars stop feeling random, budget debates feel staged, and national interest starts sounding a lot like shareholder interest. This isn't about rejecting reality or denying that some wars were necessary. It's about understanding how necessity gets exploited, how systems built for defense quietly turn into machines for extraction. Seeing this doesn't make you cynical. It makes you informed. Because power doesn't announce itself. It hides in routines, in contracts, in incentives that repeat until they feel natural. Now you know the pattern. If you want to understand how power actually works, not how it's explained, but how it operates, stay with this channel. These aren't stories you're taught in school, but they're written all over the record if you know where to look.